Welcome back. The Commission for Gender Equality has found that there's a lack of proper resources and money for shelters that are supposed to house and care for women who are the victims of abuse. You'll know how many women are violently attacked by men on a daily basis in this country. The report finds the Department of Social Development is not properly equipping those shelters to do the work that they're supposed to do. It also says the Department and the Ministry of Human Settlements should make certain changes to how these shelters are managed. You'll get some reaction to this in a moment. But first, Tamara Mathebula is the Acting Chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality. Madam Commissioner, good evening to you. Thank you for your time here on SABC News tonight. What findings did you make in this investigation?
Good evening to you, Stephen, and good evening to the viewers. The findings of this systemic investigative report that we conducted during the 2018-2019 financial period were that we found that generally there is inadequate funding in terms of allocations that are allocated, or annual allocations that are allocated to these shelters, be it fully funded shelters or partially funded shelters by the Department of Social Development. And we realized that if we look at 3 years back, the money that gets allocated to these shelters was actually getting smaller and smaller. If you look at the 2015, 16, 17 and 18, 19 financial years, we have realized that each institution or shelter was actually getting half of the money that was initially funded or allocated in 2015-16. For an example, each shelter that was getting something like 700,000 was now sitting at 250,000 rand, and that was a cause for concern for us. That was not the only thing that that was a finding. I think we also looked at the general shelter service package, and the package itself that was offered in these shelters was not standardized. And again, if you look at the package, you will find that some shelters were actually providing the full package, whereas some shelters, because of funding limitations, could not actually offer full package that will look at medical assessments, therapeutic or counseling and things like that. And we also look at the general situation in these shelters. We visited the shelters, we looked at the situation. The situations are dire, because you will find that in some situations the shelters were overcrowded and they were not safe for women to actually stay in those shelters. And again, we also were concerned by the fact that some women who ran to these shelters with the minors, the shelter was not actually ready to accommodate the poor woman who runs from a home, from a perpetrator who is threatening to kill her and the children. So the shelters were not actually providing services for the minors. And lastly, I must say that the shelters were not also catering for people living with disabilities as well as LGBTIQA communities. So those were the cause for concerns amongst the findings that we have.
Madam Commissioner, how has this situation developed? I mean, who allowed a situation where the amount of money that was going to these shelters would halve year after year? That doesn't seem to make sense, especially when we consider how many political statements we've had about how important the fight against gender violence is.
I think this is the situation that we are currently going to have a look at, because what concerns us is that if the monies that were allocated few years ago, since we started our investigations in 2013, these shelters were actually accommodating less and lesser women. Women who would go to shelters were quite few compared to quite a substantive number of women who are going to the centers today, including just generic women who are actually coming or migrating from other provinces and lacking places to stay, as well as women who come from other countries and not getting places to stay. And we realized that these centers were not discriminating based on the fact that you are not South African. You shouldn't actually come to the shelter because you are not from Gauteng or you are not from South Africa. So they were accommodating quite a big number of women and children in these shelters. shelters, yet the finances were not adequate, which is why we still need to actually sit down with the Department of Social Development, to actually sit down with them, and they should actually account to say who is responsible for allocating funds and on what basis, what criteria is applied in terms of allocating these funds to the shelters, given the situation, the surmountable situation that we have in these shelters today.
You've made certain recommendations about what must happen to fix the situation. A lot of that rests with the Department of Social Development. What do you believe needs to happen now, and does that department and the Department of Human Settlements actually have the resources to make those changes?
Yes, initially I said that this was our first report, and because it's our preliminary report, we are hoping that we will further have another investigative hearing, and we will call upon the Department of Social Development and the Department of Human Settlement, and these two departments will further sit down and respond to our findings, and that information will substantiate or will supplement the information and the recommendations that we currently have. I must also stress that our recommendations are binding, and all the departments that account or are called to come and account before us should know that our recommendations are binding, and we need to see the results within a period of 3 to 6 months.
Tamara Mathebula, ma'am, thank you very much indeed, the Acting Chair of the Commission for Gender Equality. Listening to that is Mandisa Khanyile, Director of the organisation Rise Up Against Gender Violence. Mandisa, good evening to you. Thank you for your time today. We know how many women need help in this country. It seems that we're not actually providing this help properly. What's your reaction to this report?
Firstly, the Mandisa Institute for Development last year actually developed another report about the costing of shelters, right? And what they found is that DSD gives as little as 9 rand per woman per day, up to 70 rand, that being the maximum cap. That's how much they're willing to allocate to a woman in a shelter. Whereas a person who is incarcerated in prison starts at 150 rand per day. So essentially, you're better off being the perpetrator who beat this woman and went to jail than the woman who's actually sitting in the shelter having to deal with the consequences of the perpetrator's actions. That's the situation. One thing that we also have forgotten about is that the shelter stay in this country is on average between 72 hours and 4 months at the maximum. So after 4 months, you basically get told, well, go sort yourself out after that. We can't accommodate you. There's no transitional setup that we have. It's only a few shelters that actually have those situations whereby after 4 months, if I still need to stay in a shelter, there's a review process that says, okay, I can have an extension of another 6 or 7 months whilst I get my life together, whilst I get a new job, whilst I put my kids in another school. So essentially, I'm kind of forced back to either go to family, friends, or back to my perpetrator after only 4 months of reprieve. Another thing that the report actually dealt with was the fact that there's supposed to be psychosocial support services at each and every single shelter. That's one of the requirements. But because of the lack of funding, they can't afford to bring a psychologist on board. So they either use social workers for psychosocial support, or they just don't give it at all. So you'll just have a woman sitting there for 4 months, never actually getting counseling for the reason why she got there in the first place, which again leads her to being able to go back to the perpetrator.
You would think with all of the conversations we've had about this as a society, we would do more to help these women. Why do you believe we're not doing more? Has some bureaucrat just made a mistake somewhere with the formula, or do you think there's something more to it?
I honestly think that we're not investing in the right things as a country. We're not taking the issue of gender-based violence seriously enough, so we're not investing enough. For example, this country doesn't build shelters at all. What happens is that an NPO will have a home that they own, or they'll actually build an infrastructure. And then they'll partner with governments to say, well, you can partially fund us, and then we'll go to external funders and we'll partially do the rest. So in actual fact, government doesn't take responsibility of the shelters that are already in place. So if government decides one day that they're actually not going to continue to partner with you, you then need to completely fund the shelter externally yourself. So there's really no will, there's no political will to do something about this. And even though we promise after promise, and this is similar, what I liked about the report is that they also mentioned the Tutuzela care centers, even though they're not necessarily shelters, but they're entries into shelters. And those are still completely funded by NPOs and funding organizations. Government is not funding Tutuzela care centers, even though they've made promises in 3 different zonas that they're going to do that. They're actually not trickling the funds down. So they end up closing down. So the political will to actually do what what they're saying isn't there. They keep saying the words, we're going to put money together, but the money isn't going down, and shelters are closing down, Sizela care centers are closing down, and women are being turned away just because of funds.
Mandisa Khanyile, thank you very much indeed, the director of the organisation Rise Up Against Gender Abuse.